Have you ever, really stopped to wonder what kicked us off? As humans, I mean. What pushed us from just roaming around, hunting and gathering, to actually building cities, farming fields, and, well, eventually everything else?
Right. What was that specific spark, that moment of change that just fundamentally reshaped our whole way of being?
Exactly. And for the longest time, the story we were told, in the textbooks, it seemed pretty straightforward, kind of neat, linear.
Yeah, like A led to B led to C simple.
But what if our whole understanding of that huge shift, the actual dawn of what we call civilization, has been like totally turned on its head by some really mind-blowing recent discoveries? Discoveries that are forcing us to, well, rewrite that history.
It's such a fundamental question, isn't it? It
Yeah.
gets right to the heart of what makes us human. Our ingenuity, our ability to organize, to share beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, for generations, the story felt clear. First came farming, you get a stable food supply, then people settle down, then you get complex societies, and only then, maybe, you build big temples or monuments.
Makes sense on the surface.
Sure, but the actual evidence, the archaeology, especially from one specific incredible part of the world, has thrown a massive, beautiful wrench into that tidy timeline.
A beautiful wrench. I like that. And that perfectly sets the stage for what we're digging into today. Welcome, everyone, to the deep dive.
The show where we wade through stacks of sources, research papers, articles, expert analyses, our own notes, and pull out the absolute key insights for you.
Giving you that shortcut to being really well informed on fascinating topics. And today, wow, our sources are taking us to present-day Turkey, to two absolutely extraordinary archaeological sites, Çatalhöyük and Göbekli.
And these aren't just piles of old stones. They are literal windows, almost time machines, looking back into the Neolithic Revolution. That's a period of just immense, almost unbelievable transformation, roughly between 9,000 and 7,000 BCE.
Yeah, a long time ago, but so, so critical.
And these two sites, Çatalhöyük and Göbekli, they're remarkably different purposes, different styles, they tell different stories. But together, they give us these unparalleled insights into how settled life began, the often really underestimated role of religion back then, and just the sheer incredible ingenuity of our early ancestors.
So our mission today in this deep dive is basically to unpack how these two ancient wonders completely redefine our understanding of this huge turning point in human history.
Yeah, and we'll get into some genuinely surprising facts, some thought-provoking stuff that might just make you rethink, everything you thought you knew about where we all came from.
Okay, so before we jump into the sites themselves, let's set the stage properly. Let's talk about this Neolithic Revolution, humanity's great leap. Sounds kind of dry, maybe.
Yeah, the name isn't the most exciting.
Right, but it was anything but dry or boring. It was arguably the most significant shift in, well, all of human history. It fundamentally changed everything: how we lived, how we ate, how we interacted, even how we thought about the world.
Absolutely. We're
Yeah.
talking about that huge transition from nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyles,
Yeah.
Constantly moving, following the herds, finding plants season by season,
Right, always on the move.
to settled agricultural societies, people building permanent homes, cultivating fields, and actually staying put in one place.
That's the core of it. And this massive shift kicked off roughly around 10,000 BCE, mainly centered in a region archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent.
You can picture it, right? A big crescent-shaped area stretching across Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, the Levant, and Anatolia, which is modern Turkey, exactly where our two sites are located.
And it wasn't just random, this happening there. It was like a perfect storm, wasn't it? A combination of environmental factors and human ingenuity.
Exactly. One of the biggest drivers was climate change,
Yeah.
a massive one, the end of the last ice age.
Okay.
So picture the world slowly warming up, those huge glaciers retreating, a milder, more stable climate starts to emerge.
Which creates totally new environments.
Right. Especially in places like the Fertile Crescent. Suddenly, the conditions were just right for a different way of life. Certain wild plants like wild wheat, wild barley, and animals, the ancestors of sheep and goats, they just started thriving like never before. Huge abundance.
And that abundance, combined with the milder climate, directly led to the real game changer: domestication.
Yes. And this wasn't just luck. It was a revolutionary act. It required incredible observation, patience, experimentation over generations.
It's not like someone just flipped a switch.
Not at all. Instead of just gathering wild wheat or barley wherever they found it, people started actively cultivating it. They started selecting seeds from the plants they liked best, maybe bigger grains, or stalks that didn't shatter and lose the seed so easily.
Wow, active selection even back then.
Absolutely. And same with animals. Instead of just hunting wild goats or sheep or cattle, they began to tame them, control their breeding, keep them penned up, manage them for meat, milk, hides, and eventually, much later, for pulling plows.
That shift from just taking what nature offered to actively shaping it, that's monumental.
It's almost impossible to overstate how profound that was. It was humans starting to control their food supply, not just react to it. Hugely experimental.
And the immediate impact on how people lived must have been just staggering, right? If you don't have to constantly follow the food.
You could stay put.
Yeah, you can literally put down roots.
And these changes led directly, logically, to fixed settlements, the very first permanent villages, which then grew into towns and eventually into these things we call proto-cities.
And when people started living closer together, year-round, cheek by jowl, new social structures must have started popping up, more complex ways of organizing things.
Exactly. That's the foundation for everything we think of as civilization. Organized labor, ways to make community decisions, specialized crafts, someone's good at making pots, someone else at tools, maybe even the earliest forms of leadership or governance. It just snowballed.
And that's precisely where our two stars today, Çatalhöyük and Göbekli Tepe, fit in. They both fall within this critical period, 9,000 to 7,000 BCE. But they offer such different views on this whole transition, almost contradictory takes.
They really do. Çatalhöyük, which we'll definitely get into, is like the poster child for a thriving, settled agricultural community. It's an early blueprint for urban life, almost. Complex social order, really fascinating architecture, rich symbolic culture. It's all there.
Okay, so that sounds like it fits the traditional farm first, then settlement model pretty well.
It does, largely.
But then there's Göbekli, and you said the site completely upended everything. What was the old assumption, and how did Göbekli just smash it? Because this is where it gets really mind-bending.
Okay, so for centuries, the basic archaeological story went like this. First, you invent farming. That gives you surplus food. Then, because you have extra food and time, people can settle down in villages. And then, only after all that's established, maybe you build a temple or some other big monument. Agriculture was seen as the necessary first step.
The prerequisite.
The prerequisite, exactly. Göbekli just blows that sequence out of the water. Its discovery forces us to seriously consider the idea that maybe, just maybe, monumental religious structures, these big ritual centers, actually came before widespread farming and permanent villages.
Whoa.
It suggests that the desire for shared spiritual experience, the deep human need to gather, to perform rituals, to worship together, that might have been the engine that actually drove people to cooperate, to settle down, and then figure out agriculture to support those gatherings.
So faith or ritual, not food surplus, as the original architect of civilization.
It's a possibility.
Yeah.
A true paradigm shift in how we think about our origins. Temples before farms. It's radical.
That is captivating. Temples before farms.
Okay, let's absolutely dive into Göbekli first, the site that sent these shockwaves. Where exactly is it, and when was it in use?
Right. Göbekli is in southeastern Turkey, near the city of Şanlıurfa. It's a region just incredibly rich in history. And it was active for a really long time, from about 9,600 BCE up to around 7,000 BCE. So spanning a huge chunk of that early Neolithic period.
A very long time. And its discovery, mainly in the mid-1990s by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, was just revolutionary, doesn't even quite cover it.
What did people think before Schmidt came along?
Well, before Göbekli, the oldest known examples of monumental architecture, like big temples or public buildings, were thought to be much, much later. Maybe 6,000 BCE, perhaps even later, and always tied to established farming villages in Mesopotamia. Schmidt was initially just surveying what looked like a natural hill littered with some old stones, but he quickly realized he was onto something vastly older and way more complex than anyone had ever imagined. He knew almost immediately how significant it was. He famously called it a cathedral on a hill, built by the world's very first stonemasons.
A cathedral on a hill, built by hunter-gatherers. And the big revelation, the core of it, is these absolutely massive, mind-boggling structures built before people were really farming. What does that mean practically? It feels like finding, I don't know, a smartphone from the Stone Age.
It's that level of disruptive, yeah.
Yeah.
The architecture is just It's an enigma. The signature features are these iconic T-shaped stone pillars.
I've seen pictures. They look huge.
They're astonishingly big. They stand anywhere from 3 to 6 meters tall. That's like up to 20 feet, the height of a 2-story house. And some weigh up to 50 tons.
50 tons? How on earth?
We'll get to that. But what's also fascinating is they look kind of human, don't they?
Yeah.
They're anthropomorphic. Many researchers think they represent highly stylized human figures, maybe powerful ancestors, maybe gods or spirits. You can sometimes see hints of arms carved on the sides, hands pointing towards the front, even belts or loincloths suggested. They're like these silent, imposing figures watching over the space.
Wow. And they weren't just standing alone, right? They were part of larger structures.
Exactly. They're arranged into these precise, circular enclosures, typically about 10 to 30 meters across 30 to 100 feet. Each circle usually has 2 huge T-pillars in the center, often facing each other, and then they're surrounded by a ring of slightly smaller T-pillars embedded in walls made of rough stone.
And the carvings on them. You mentioned carvings.
Oh, the carvings are incredible, especially for that age. They are just teeming with imagery. Snakes, foxes, vultures, bulls, wild boars, gazelles, lions, a whole menagerie of animals, plus abstract symbols, and even a few very rare depictions of actual human figures. It shows such a sophisticated level of artistic skill and symbolic thinking, way beyond what we used to associate with hunter-gatherer groups.
Okay, the construction. How? 50-ton pillars, moved and erected by people with only stone tools. No wheels, no domesticated animals for heavy lifting. It just seems impossible.
It boggles the mind, doesn't it? It presents this profound puzzle. We're talking hundreds of people involved. They must have quarried these massive limestone blocks from nearby bedrock, probably using flint tools to chip away and lever them out.
Just brute force and persistence.
Brute force, incredible persistence, and probably some clever techniques. Archaeologists think they likely slid them on wooden rollers or maybe greased logs, maybe using ropes made of plant fibers. Then, to raise them upright, they might have used earthen ramps and lever systems, combined with just immense coordinated human effort.
It wasn't just muscle, though, was it? It required serious planning.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This wasn't random. It implies a deep, intuitive understanding of basic engineering principles, long before anyone wrote down formulas for geometry or physics. It signifies a massive amount of coordination, forward planning, and sustained labor over long periods. This wasn't just a weekend project.
It feels like it would need a strong leader, a king or something directing everyone, but these were hunter-gatherers.
Exactly. That's the paradox. This level of collective effort implies incredibly strong social bonds, a shared vision, a powerful shared purpose that could unite maybe hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of people from different bands or groups, possibly groups that were usually independent or even rivals.
What could possibly motivate that? Which brings us back to Schmidt's temple's first theory. It really is radical, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Schmidt's core idea was that the need for religion, for ritual, as embodied by Göbekli, might have been the primary driver, the catalyst, that brought people together on this unprecedented scale.
So the act of building was itself a unifying ritual.
Perhaps. And that coming together, the shared labor, the communal experience, the spiritual connection forged while building and using these places that could have spurred the social cohesion and innovation needed for agriculture and settled life to eventually take root. So yeah, instead of farming leading to temples, maybe the very act of creating and gathering at these temples fostered the conditions necessary for farming.
So these structures, they're definitely considered temples.
Overwhelmingly, yes. They're interpreted as sacred spaces used for religious ceremonies, rituals, maybe feasts, possibly serving as pilgrimage sites, or gathering places for various hunter-gatherer groups across the region, maybe coming together seasonally for important events.
And the symbolism in those carvings? The animals, vultures, snakes, foxes that must tie into the religious purpose, right? What do archaeologists think they might represent?
The animal carvings are a huge area of study and speculation. Vultures, for example, appear quite often.
Like we saw at Çatalhöyük Lake.
Exactly, suggesting a shared symbolic language, perhaps. Vultures are often linked to death and the disposal of the dead, particularly practices like excarnation, where bodies are left exposed for birds to clean the bones. So vultures might symbolize death, transformation, the journey to the afterlife.
Okay.
Snakes are common symbols in many cultures, often representing rebirth, because they shed their skin, or maybe underworld forces, protection. Foxes, being cunning and nocturnal, could be trickster figures or spirit guides. These weren't just pretty pictures. They were almost certainly key players in their myths, their cosmology, their understanding of the world, powerful symbols.
So even without clear evidence of kings or priests in charge, the sheer scale implies
What?
a shared belief system powerful enough to mobilize huge numbers of people.
It has to, doesn't it? While we don't see signs of, say, palaces or elite burials suggesting a rigid hierarchy like later civilizations, the coordination needed for Göbekli Tepe implies incredibly strong social bonds and a profound unifying belief system that resonated across different groups and motivated this extraordinary collective action.
Now, economically, environmentally, Göbekli's location in the Fertile Crescent sounds absolutely critical. This natural abundance must have been key to supporting these large gatherings.
It's crucial. You're right in the heart of where wild wheat, wild barley, wild rye were growing naturally and abundantly. Plus, huge herds of game animals, gazelles, wild asses, wild sheep, wild goats. This natural richness meant that large groups of hunter-gatherers could congregate and sustain themselves for extended periods, even without full-blown farming.
Nature provided the catering, essentially.
In a way, yes. So their main strategy was still hunting and gathering. But, interestingly, the sources mentioned finding some early evidence of processed wild wheat grains at the site.
So they weren't farming, but they were maybe experimenting.
Possibly. It suggests they were at least beginning to understand the potential of these wild cereals, maybe harvesting them intensively, maybe even tending wild stands to encourage growth. It wasn't settled agriculture as we know it, but it could represent the very first steps towards it, the beginnings of that crucial knowledge.
And they weren't isolated either, were they? You mentioned trade.
Definitely not isolated. We find stone tools made from types of flint that aren't found right near the site, and especially obsidian volcanic glass, fantastic for sharp tools, which had to be brought in from sources hundreds of kilometers away, likely in eastern Anatolia.
So active trade networks were already operating.
Yes, indicating connections and exchange between different communities across a pretty wide region.
And the climate, again, that warmer, wetter period after the Ice Age around 9000 BCE that must have helped support these large populations of plants and animals, made these big gatherings feasible.
Absolutely. The stable, richer environment was a major enabling factor. It provided the resources needed to feed hundreds of people involved in the construction and rituals for potentially long stretches of time.
But then as mysteriously as it arose, Göbekli was abandoned, or at least parts of it were.
Yes, that's another fascinating piece of the puzzle. Around 8000 BCE, something really strange happened. Some of the circular enclosures, these magnificent structures, were deliberately, intentionally buried, filled in completely with earth, stone debris, even animal bones.
Why would they bury their own temples?
It's a huge question. Klaus Schmidt himself thought perhaps they believed the structures had fulfilled their purpose, or maybe their spiritual power needed to be contained. Another strong theory is that as agriculture became more established, as people started settling into permanent farming villages elsewhere, these large, central ritual gathering places simply lost their importance. The focus shifted from these big communal hunter-gatherer shrines to more localized village-based beliefs.
So the world changed around it, and its role faded.
Possibly. It's almost like the site's completion mirrored the completion of the Neolithic Revolution itself. A very transition that might have helped spark. Its grand purpose fulfilled, it was respectfully put to rest.
Wow. Okay, from the sheer awe and mystery of Göbekli, where maybe that spark of settled life first ignited through ritual, let's jump forward a bit in time and shift focus. Let's move to Çatalhöyük. This site offers a completely different window, doesn't it? A blueprint, almost, of early urban life.
Exactly. If Göbekli hints at the catalyst for change, Çatalhöyük shows us the result, a large, thriving, complex, settled community in full swing.
Where is Çatalhöyük located, and when was it buzzing?
Çatalhöyük sits on the Konya Plain in south-central Turkey, a very different environment, a flat, fertile plain. And it was active mainly from about 7,400 BCE down to around 5,700 BCE, so it overlaps with the later period of Göbekli, but really hits its stride as Göbekli is declining or abandoned.
So it represents that next phase, the established agricultural settlement.
Precisely. And it's hugely significant globally because it's one of the oldest, largest, and best preserved early farming settlements ever found. We're talking maybe 8,000, perhaps even up to 10,000 people living there at its peak. That's a proto-city.
10,000 people, that's incredible for that time period.
It really is. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site for good reason. It gives us this incredibly intimate, detailed look into what life was actually like in these very early agricultural societies, how they built their homes, how they organized themselves, their art, their beliefs.
And the first thing that jumps out about Çatalhöyük visually is the architecture. It's so distinctive, this honeycomb layout.
Yes. Imagine houses rectangular, made of mud brick packed incredibly tightly together, literally wall to wall, with no streets, no lanes, no alleys, no courtyards in between them. Just a dense mass of dwellings.
That sounds incredibly cramped. And how did people get in or out? Or even move around?
That's the ingenious part. They used the roofs. The roofs were essentially the public space, the walkways. You'd move across the flat rooftops from house to house, and then you'd enter your own home through an opening in the ceiling, climbing down a wooden ladder.
Wow. So entry through the roof, that must have had advantages.
Definitely. For defense, it was brilliant. The continuous outer walls of the settlement presented a solid, unbroken barrier. No ground-level doors or windows for enemies to force. It made the whole place like a fortress.
Makes sense.
But it was also just a really efficient way to use space. As the population grew on this flat plain, building upwards and accessing via the roof allowed for incredible density. And the houses themselves, while tightly packed, were remarkably similar inside.
Similar how?
Mostly around 25 to 30 square meters, not huge, but efficiently laid out. They typically had plastered hearths for cooking and heat, specific areas for storage often built as niches or bins, and raised platforms against the walls.
Platforms for what? Sleeping?
Yeah, probably both. Living areas, and this general uniformity in house size and layout is one of the things that suggests a fairly egalitarian community, which we can talk more about.
Okay, but you mentioned something else found inside the houses. Something a bit more, intimate. Burials.
Yes. And this is where it gets really fascinating and maybe a bit eerie for us today. They often buried their dead directly beneath the floors of the houses, often under those raised platforms where people lived and slept.
Sleeping right above your ancestors.
Literally. Imagine that connection. It wasn't about separating the dead in cemeteries. The deceased remained physically and symbolically part of the household, part of the foundation of the home.
That suggests a really deep reverence for ancestors, a
A
continuity.
profound connection to lineage, absolutely. But the houses weren't just functional spaces or tombs. They were also canvases. The interior walls were carefully plastered with a fine white or light-colored mud plaster, making them smooth. And then they were often painted.
Painted with what?
Vibrant colors, reds, blacks, sometimes yellows. And not just solid colors, they painted elaborate scenes and motifs. Geometric patterns, wild animals, bulls and leopards are very common, and human figures. It shows that art and symbolism weren't just for special occasions. They were integrated right into the fabric of daily domestic life.
So back to the burials under the floor. You said it shows ancestor reverence, but wasn't there something else, something unusual about how some people were buried? Something about heads?
Yes, this is one of the most intriguing aspects. While many burials seem complete, a significant number of bodies were found buried without their skulls.
Headless burials. Where did the heads go?
Well, evidence suggests the skulls were sometimes removed after death,
Right.
possibly after an initial burial or exposure period. These skulls were then apparently cleaned, maybe plastered to recreate facial features, sometimes painted with ochre and then circulated, kept perhaps displayed within the houses, or reburied separately later.
Plastered skulls. Wow, why would they do that?
It points towards a complex ritual practice, likely related to what anthropologists call secondary burial treatment. It could be part of ancestor veneration, where the skull, seen as the seat of identity or spirit, was preserved and honored. It might also connect to the idea of excarnation we mentioned with Göbeklit's vultures. Maybe the body was exposed first, bones collected later, and the skull given special treatment. It suggests a very different understanding of death and the body than we typically have today.
Definitely a complex spiritual life. Okay, shifting gears to their economy and how they lived day to day. Unlike Göbekli Tepe, Çatalhöyük was clearly agricultural, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Firmly based on farming and animal herding. The archaeological evidence is abundant. They cultivated crops like emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley, peas, lentils, all the Neolithic staples.
Hearing animals.
They had domesticated sheep and goats, and importantly also cattle, managing herds for meat, milk, hides, bones for tools. This agricultural package was the core of their economy. It's what allowed such a large population to live densely in one place year-round.
But they didn't totally give up the old ways, did they? Hunting and gathering still played a role.
That's right. It shows they were pragmatic. They still hunted wild animals, wild cattle, aurochs, deer, boar, and gathered wild plants, fruits, nuts from the surrounding area. It supplemented their diet and probably provided variety and resources farming couldn't. They used everything available.
And trade. Was Çatalhöyük connected like Göbekli seemed to be?
Very much so, maybe even more central to trade networks. The source specifically highlights their role in the obsidian trade. There's volcano Hasan Daya, about 130 kilometers away, which was a major source of high-quality obsidian.
That black volcanic glass, super sharp for tools.
Exactly, perfect for blades, knives, arrowheads. Çatalhöyük seems to have controlled or at least been heavily involved in processing and trading this obsidian across a wide region, reaching hundreds of kilometers.
So it was like a manufacturing and trading hub.
To some extent, yes. And it wasn't just obsidian. We find seashells, probably from the Mediterranean or maybe the Red Sea, hundreds of kilometers away. Certain types of flint and stone for tools also came from distant sources. It shows they were plugged into a really extensive network of exchange. They weren't isolated at all.
Okay, what about this social structure within this proto-city? You mentioned that similar house sizes suggested egalitarianism, less hierarchy.
That's the prevailing interpretation, and it's quite remarkable for a settlement of this size. There's a striking lack of obvious evidence for a ruling class or extreme wealth disparity. New palaces, no massively richer tombs compared to others. The houses are generally similar in size and construction. Grave goods, the items buried with people, are fairly consistent across the population. It suggests a society that was, relatively speaking, quite egalitarian, perhaps organized around households or kinship groups, rather than a centralized authority.
But you hinted there might be some nuances. Some houses maybe had more stuff.
Right. It's not perfectly uniform. Some houses do have more elaborate wall paintings, more layers of plasters, suggesting longer occupation or more care, maybe a greater concentration of symbolic objects like figurines or those plastered skulls we talked about.
So not necessarily wealth, but maybe prestige,
Yeah.
ritual importance.
Exactly. It doesn't necessarily point to a rigid class system based on material wealth, but perhaps a more fluid system based on ritual knowledge, lineage, age, or social influence. Certain families or individuals might have held special roles or prestige within the community, reflected in the symbolic richness of their homes without it translating into king-like power or vastly different living standards.
Fascinating. And that brings us right back to their religious and symbolic life, which seems so embedded in the houses themselves. Those wall paintings sound incredible.
They really are. They're some of the earliest complex narrative scenes we have. Hunting scenes are common, showing groups of small human figures often depicted in action surrounding large, powerful animals like giant bulls or deer. Leopards are also frequently depicted, sometimes in pairs, flanking figures or entrances.
And the human figures, sometimes shown without heads.
Yes, which ties back into those burial practices and skull removal. And the famous vulture shrine paintings, these seem to vividly illustrate excarnation rituals, with large vultures swooping over headless human bodies. It's pretty graphic, but gives us a direct window into their beliefs about death and the transition of the soul.
And then there are the figurines, the mother goddess figures everyone associates with Çatalhöyük.
Ah, yes, the figurines. They found many small figurines made of clay or stone. The most famous type is the seated female figure, often depicted as quite plump or heavy-breasted, sometimes shown giving birth, or in the most iconic example, seated on a throne-like seat with her hands resting on the heads of two large felines, probably leopards.
The seated woman of Çatalhöyük, she looks powerful.
She certainly does. And for a long time, she and similar figures were widely interpreted as representations of a great mother goddess, a central deity linked to fertility, nature, life, and death. This interpretation was very popular, especially in the mid-20th century.
But you mentioned there's debate now.
There is. While the symbolism of fertility and female power seems clear, many archaeologists today are more cautious about labeling her definitively as the mother goddess, like a single universal deity. They suggest these figures might represent different things, perhaps revered female ancestors, symbols of lineage or household continuity, representations of elders, or maybe embodying broader concepts of fecundity and life-giving power without being a specific goddess character in a pantheon. The meaning might have been more varied or nuanced.
So the interpretation is still evolving. What about the bull symbolism? That seems really strong too.
Incredibly strong. Actual bull horns, sometimes from massive wild aurochs, were often mounted on walls or set into benches or pillars inside the houses. Sometimes entire bull heads were plastered and painted, incorporated right into the architecture. Bulls clearly held immense symbolic importance, likely representing strength, virility, power, maybe danger, perhaps connected to male roles or aspects of the wild they were trying to harness and propitiate. This bull cult seems widespread in the Neolithic Near East.
So if you put it all together, what was daily life like? What were people doing all day in this packed city?
Well, the daily rhythm would have revolved heavily around agriculture planting, tending crops, harvesting, and the constant demanding work of grinding grain into flour using saddle querns, which were large stone slabs.
Backbreaking work, I imagine.
Definitely.
Hmm.
Skeletal remains show wear and tear consistent with that kind of labor. Then there was tending the animals' sheep, goats, cattle. Bring them in and out, milking, shearing perhaps. Beyond food production, there was tool making, chipping obsidian and flint, making bone tools. Weaving was also important.
Weaving. They had textiles back then.
Yes, we have indirect evidence, like clay seals with textile impressions, finds of spindle whorls used for spinning thread, and tools like bone needles and shuttles. They were likely weaving fabrics from wool or plant fibers like flax. Also, basketry was common.
And rituals. Were those daily things too?
It seems likely. The burials under the floor, the wall paintings, the figurines, the bullhorns they suggest ritual and belief were woven into the very fabric of the house and daily life, not just confined to special temples or occasions. And of course, maintaining the mud brick houses themselves would have required ongoing work, replastering walls and floors.
What about division of labor? Men doing one thing, women another.
We can make educated guesses, but it's hard to be certain. It's often assumed women were more involved in tasks centered around the home, like grain processing, cooking, weaving, raising children, while men might have focused more on hunting, herding, trading, and maybe heavy construction. But the source cautions against rigid assumptions. Tasks might have been shared or more fluid than we imagine.
And craftsmanship, beyond tools and weaving.
They clearly had a strong aesthetic sense. They made beads from stone, bone, and shell, creating necklaces and other ornaments. Pottery was developing, becoming more sophisticated over time. Their artistry wasn't just functional. They clearly valued decoration and symbolic expression.
And their health. Good diet overall.
Generally, yes. The mix of grains, legumes, meat from domestic and wild animals, plus wild plants suggests a reasonably balanced diet, certainly better than some later agricultural societies that became overly reliant on one or two crops. But as mentioned, they paid a physical price, evidence of arthritis, joint problems, probably from the repetitive hard labor of farming and grinding. And living so densely likely had implications for sanitation and disease, although evidence for major epidemics isn't prominent.
So this thriving proto-city, it didn't last forever either, did it? Like Göbekli, it eventually declined.
That's right. After flourishing for well over 1,000 years, the population started to shrink around 6,000 BCE, and the site seems to have been completely abandoned by about 4,700 BCE.
Why? What happened? Same reasons as Göbekli, maybe.
Possibly. Similar factors played a role, but maybe with different emphasis, because it was a settled farming community. Climate change is often suggested, perhaps increasing aridity on the Konya Plain made farming more difficult. Depletion of resources is another possibility after centuries of intensive farming and wood gathering. The land might have become less productive, the local environment degraded.
Or maybe social reasons, internal conflicts, disease.
All possibilities. Living in such close quarters could have exacerbated social tensions or the spread of disease. Or perhaps the model of concentrating so many people in one large site simply became less advantageous, and people began dispersing into smaller, more scattered villages across the landscape. The exact reasons are still debated, likely a combination of factors.
But whatever caused its end, Çatalhöyük's legacy is just huge for understanding this period.
Immense. It's like this unique, incredibly well-preserved laboratory for studying early settled life. The sheer detail recovered by excavators like James Millard originally, and especially Ian Hodder's more recent, meticulous work, gives us insights into the daily routines, social organization, beliefs, and art of an early agricultural society that are simply unmatched anywhere else from this era.
Okay, so we've explored Çatalhöyük, this amazing blueprint of early urban agricultural life, and Göbekli Tepe, the mind-bending mystery of the first temples built by hunter-gatherers. Let's really bring them together now. It's this fascinating tale of two sites, both active during that same critical Neolithic window, 9,000 to 7,000 BCE, but showing such different paths humanity was taking almost simultaneously.
Exactly. Putting them side by side really highlights the incredible diversity and complexity of the Neolithic Revolution. It wasn't one single uniform process.
Right. So key distinction number one, the nature of the settlement itself. Çatalhöyük is clearly a fully settled, permanent agricultural town or proto-city, home base.
Whereas Göbekli Tepe looks much more like a regional ritual center, a place people traveled to for ceremonies, built and used primarily by groups who are still largely nomadic hunter-gatherers, not living there year-round.
And their architectural focus is poles apart too. Çatalhöyük is all about the houses, dense, domestic spaces built for living, for families, for generations.
While Göbekli is all about the monuments, these huge, non-residential, temple-like enclosures, clearly built for communal gathering, ritual performance, maybe feasting, but not for living in.
Then there's the economy. Çatalhöyük is firmly rooted in farming and herding, producing their food.
Göbekli, while showing those tantalizing hints of early plant use, was fundamentally supported by hunting and gathering the rich wild resources of the area. It reminds us the shift to farming was patchy, gradual, complex.
And even their symbolism, while sharing some elements like animal motifs, feels different in emphasis. Çatalhöyük has that strong focus on the female figurines, the bulls within the domestic space, spirituality tied to home, fertility, maybe lineage.
While Göbekli is dominated by those enigmatic T-pillars and that wider zoo of often fierce or wild animals, snakes, foxes, vultures, boars, suggesting perhaps a cosmology more focused on the wild, the spirit world, maybe celestial events, or the hunt.
Yet despite all these differences, they're connected by some really important common threads, aren't they?
Absolutely. Both are undeniable pioneers of the Neolithic. They represent those crucial, early experimental stages of humanity, transforming its relationship with the world.
Both show incredibly sophisticated symbolic and religious systems. Long before writing, long before organized states, people were clearly grappling with deep questions about life, death, the cosmos, and expressing it in complex ways.
Yes, this wasn't just about survival.
Yeah.
Abstract thought, spirituality, art. They were clearly central to human life even 10,000 years ago.
And both were part of wider networks. They weren't isolated bubbles. The obsidian, the seashells, they prove people were connected, trading goods and likely ideas, too, across significant distances.
Definite. Part of an interconnected world.
And maybe most importantly, both sites represent this incredible leap in human social organization. Whether it's managing the daily life of 10,000 people packed together, or coordinating hundreds of hunter-gatherers to build monuments weighing dozens of tons.
Yeah, let's unpack that a bit. What does that tell us about human ingenuity? It suggests our capacity for complex cooperation, for large-scale planning, for shared purpose is much, much older than we used to think.
Older than cities, older than states, older than kings, even older than widespread farming, maybe.
Possibly. It suggests that shared belief systems, communal rituals, maybe just the sheer power of a collective project, could be the glue that held early societies together and allowed them to achieve things that seem almost impossible for small independent bands. That social technology might be just as important as stone tool technology.
That's an incredible thought, and it really brings us to the enduring legacy. Why do these sites, Çatalhöyük and Göbekli, still matter so much? Why do they resonate today?
Well, fundamentally, they help us answer those deep questions about our own origins. They challenge the simple stories and give us a much richer, more complex picture of how we became who we are. Çatalhöyük illuminates the nuts and bolts of early agricultural society, how people actually lived together in these new, dense settlements. The domestic details, the art, the social structure.
While Göbekli throws out that provocative idea about the power of religion and ritual as maybe the driver of settlement, not just a consequence, it flips the script, suggesting shared belief might have been the engine pulling people together in the first place.
And together, they just unveil this incredible tapestry of early human art and spirituality. They show us people deeply engaged with symbolism, expressing profound ideas through architecture and imagery thousands of years before writing.
They really help us trace that winding path of social evolution, don't they? From mobile foragers to complex, settled societies that eventually paved the way for everything that followed. They're like crucial chapters in the human story that were missing or misread for a long time.
Absolutely. And their contribution to archaeology itself is immense. Çatalhöyük, first dug by James Mellart back in the 60s, has seen incredibly innovative work under Ian Hodder since the 90s. Hodder's project really pioneered new, more detailed, reflexive methods, focusing on the context of individual houses and lives. That work solidified its UNESCO status.
And Göbekli. Well, Klaus Schmidt's discovery was just one of those genuine paradigm-shifting moments in archaeology. His dedication to carefully uncovering it really opened up a whole new understanding of prehistory, and it rightly got its own UNESCO designation in 2018, becoming this global icon of deep history.
And the research continues. Both are still active living laboratories. Archaeologists, anthropologists, geneticists, climate scientists, specialists from all over the world are still working there, using new technologies, making new finds that constantly refine and sometimes challenge our understanding.
They're also hugely important cultural heritage sites for Turkey and major draws for tourism now, especially Göbekli, which has been branded as ground zero of history. It's captured the public imagination.
It really has.
And it's important to remember, as you said, the science isn't all settled. There's still big debates, right?
Oh, definitely. Was Göbekli only a temple, or did it have other functions? Was it a gathering place, a trade hub, maybe even astronomical observatory? What exactly did the Çatalhöyük figurines mean to the people who made and used them? Was society there truly egalitarian? Or are we missing subtle clues about hierarchy?
These ongoing questions are healthy, aren't they? They keep the field dynamic.
Exactly. It shows that understanding the past is an ongoing process, not a finished book. Each new find, each new interpretation adds another layer, forces us to think more critically about how complex and varied the human journey has been, which raises an important question.
It does indeed. So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, let's try to synthesize. Çatalhöyük and Göbekli, they span that absolutely pivotal period, 9,000 to 7,000 BCE. And they stand as these profound symbols of humanity's transition to settled life, the formation of complex societies.
Yeah, Çatalhöyük gives us that vivid picture of daily life, the architecture, the culture of an early farming community. It shows us what that settled world looked like, up close.
While Göbekli delivers that powerful punch, demonstrating the incredible unifying force of religion, of ritual, maybe pushing people together on a huge scale before farming was even widespread, it really challenges our assumptions about what came first.
Together, they just represent these critical, incredibly early steps on humanity's long journey, from being mobile hunter-gatherers to becoming the builders of complex civilizations we are today. They're just an unparalleled legacy, historically and culturally.
So as you listening reflect on these ancient places, maybe think about this. How much of our own modern need to gather, whether it's for sports, for concerts, for religious services, even just community meetings, how much of that still echoes that ancient, deep-seated human drive for collective experience, for shared purpose that we see at Göbekli and Çatalhöyük?
That's a great point.
Maybe these ancient impulses, this desire to come together to create something bigger than ourselves, still subtly shapes our world, our communities, our built environments in ways we don't even fully recognize, just like it did for the people who built these incredible sites thousands of years ago. What else, you have to wonder, might our deep past be subtly influencing in our lives right now?